so you have to walk me through it.
No, you're just fine. Thank you so much, Donna. We're excited to have Donna Kelly here. Her full bio is on the drive, and I left my phone, but Donna has been in the field working with victims of crime 30 plus years. She's been a prosecutor in Washington, right, or Oregon? I always forget which state.
Oregon for a short time, then I came here.
That's
Yeah.
right. And then she was in Utah County, I think, for a big portion of her prosecuting career, has worked for Utah Prosecution Council, has been an educator. Donna and I have go way back. We started when she was with the Utah Prosecution Council as an educator. And so we are just so grateful. She's been with Salt Lake District Attorney's Office and now is an attorney for victims' rights at the Utah Crime Victims Legal Clinic. So such an expert, and we are so grateful that she took the time out of her insane schedule to be with us here today. So we'll let you take it away, Donna.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really jealous of all of you that are down there where it's warm, because today it's pretty icky here. It's got sort of slushy, rainy, snowy thing going on here today, so kind of cold and miserable. So be grateful that you're down there. So the last presentation, I got to hear part of that, and it was so great and so practical and helpful. Mine is not going to be as practical. I'm going to talk more about general things and policies and things like that. But I really wanted a chance to, how did that happen? Okay, I really wanted a chance to share with you some things that I've learned over the years about eliminating bias from our cases. Bias by the judge or bias by the jury can be very damaging to the case, and how we can make our cases more personal, more individual. These are not sexual assault and domestic violence cases are not cookie cutter cases. They're not just cases where you check the boxes off. They involve real people's lives that are every victim I've ever worked with over the last 32 years is very individual, very different. Well, how do we present that in a courtroom setting? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about as we go forward today. And please ask me any questions that you have. If I don't notice that you're asking a question, Vicki or somebody, will you let me know? Like, will somebody take a look at the chat once in a while and see if there's any questions?
Yes, we'll keep an eye on the chat, or if there's questions in the room, we'll let you know.
I really want to be able to answer questions that you guys want to hear, things you want to hear about. So please do not hesitate to interrupt. Okay, so the first thing I think we all need to recognize, if you've ever watched like one episode of Law and Order, you kind of know that the victims are not very realistic about the system and how difficult it is, and how it can be very, very stressful to participate in the criminal justice system. They often think that, the criminal justice system is going to fix all their problems and their life is going to be, wonderful and perfect and rainbows and butterflies from then on. And it's really not. It may provide a sense of justice for victims, and hopefully we all encourage that. But they will still have problems they have to deal with in their lives, and so a part of our task is to get them to be realistic about what the system can and can't do for victims. So I just wanted to talk for just a second about the typical victim's journey and how they come into the system. And this, again, is not true of every single victim, but it's, I think, generally the path that many victims are taking. And the first thing is that they often go to friends or family first that are supportive of them generally and tell them what's happened. They need some some support. They need some advice. They need to have somebody with them when they are going forward. So they often will go to somebody that's close to them first. Many victims will engage in therapy, and that again is a healing kind of process for them to go through, and can be extremely beneficial for victims. Then they go to, and then they may many victims make the decision to report to police. And so the police stage is, encouraging victims to talk about what's happened, give a full disclosure, get the details of what happened and gather evidence. And then they go to if the prosecution files the case, then is when victims begin to encounter the first real idea that this is an adversarial system. I mean, we pride ourselves in America of having an adversarial system. If we have an adversarial system, when people are battling it out, then the truth will emerge. That's the theory anyway. And so this is really the time that they encounter the first idea that, hey, there's going to be opposition to me. And I think we need to, be prepared for them coming into the system with these, hopefully many victims come into the system with having had support from family members, from therapy, even from the police investigation itself, and getting to tell their story like one-sided without being challenged, right? And so when they come into the prosecution, we have to look at the cases really closely. We have to ask tough questions. We have to decide if there's enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And so this is the first time they really see that it's going to be adversarial. I had one victim describe it to me as kind of like, well, I thought I knew how the system worked. I've attended the University of Law and Order. And I thought that was kind of a good way to put it, is that they watch TV and they get their idea of what the system is like through TV. And we all know Law and Order is not a very accurate representation of what happens with victims' cases. Every time I watch Law and Order, I wind up wanting to scream at my television screen because they do things all the time that never happen. Like, for example, just one example of the many, in the Law and Order TV series, the defense attorney always brings his client in to sit down and talk to the prosecutor. And, they just have this chat about everything with the defendant. And you know how many times that's happened to me in 32 years of prosecuting? Zero times has that happened. And so that just gives you an idea of how people's perception of the criminal justice system can be very different than the reality. We also have to recognize that this process that begins unfolding and winds up on them participating with the prosecutor is a very stressful, very difficult process. When you walk into the district attorney's office, it's usually not one of your best days, because you're gonna, they're gonna ask tough questions. They're going to tell you what they can and can't do. They're going to make you repeat many parts of your story. I mean, it is a process that is challenging for victims. I often describe it as, victims are coming into the system like they've been floating in a canoe down a river pretty uneventfully. And they're floating down this river and they think, oh, this isn't too bad. I told my family members, they were supportive and kind to me. I told my therapist, and that was a great experience. Even the police officer, just let me talk for as long as I needed to, whatever. And they're floating down the stream in kind of an unchallenging waterway. But you and I and everyone else in the criminal justice system knows the waterfall is coming. They will be challenged. They will be questions. They will be challenged. They will often be attacked by the defense as the case enters the court stage. So it is our job to prepare them for the waterfall. we have to prepare them for what's coming. And we know what's coming and they don't know yet. So we have to prepare them for that. And the first thing is that they are going to encounter people with bias. Every human being has biases based on how they grew up, based on what they, what they consumed as an individual. And so we all have biases and that we may or may not recognize. But the key is we have to develop a plan for the biases and how to deal with those. And I'm going to use the example of a case of mine as we go through this, as we talk together today. I'm going to go through some of the biases that appeared in one of my cases. And it was a case in which a rabbi came forward and disclosed that he had been abused 20 years earlier as a child by his nanny. So in that case, we had biases to confront at each stage of the case because she was a female perpetrator, which are, it's a smaller percentage of our cases are female perpetrators. She was an older woman, and in sitting in front of the jury, especially 20 years later, she looked like this nice little grandmotherly lady, right? So the physical perception is not what the judge and the jury are going to expect. It was a delayed report by a victim, and I guarantee you that the majority of jurors that are sitting in the jury box think, hey, if this happened to me, I'd pick up the phone and call 911. But victims almost never do that. I think I've had one case in 32 years where a victim actually immediately called 911. So victims almost never do that. And how do you explain that delay and confront the bias against the victim because of the delay? Like, well, if they didn't report it for 20 years, it must not have happened. And then finally, that males are not real victims. That was one of the biases that we had in our case. A lot of people in our society have this attitude towards males of, oh, he's not a victim, he just got lucky, right? So we have to confront that bias as well. We have a duty, I think, as people in the system to confront biases. And even if it's only just one case at a time, we have the duty to deal with these biases and put out there in our society that those are not accurate. Because otherwise, how are we ever going to move forward as a society and handle these cases fairly if we don't confront those biases? The first thing is we need to keep our own biases in check. And I'm going to use one example from one of my life. When I was a teenager, miniskirts were in style. They were the first time that women, really wore miniskirts. So this is in the 70s, okay? And my grandmother had a saying, and her saying was, nice girls don't wear short skirts. Nice girls don't wear short skirts. She would always want me, to wear longer hemlines, and she didn't like, her granddaughters wearing miniskirts. Well, that was kind of a bias that existed at that time, okay? And it was just something that I grew up with that was, in my brain, in my culture. So how do we correct biases that exist? Well, the first thing is we become aware of our own biases. Am I looking at a case with one of my own biases? What if one of my victims was wearing a miniskirt? I need to make sure that I'm aware of my own biases in dealing with a victim. We need to slow down because biases are sort of a psychological way of quickly assessing things. And so we need to slow ourselves down and say, okay, now wait a minute. Just because X exists doesn't mean that there wasn't a sexual assault, doesn't mean there wasn't domestic violence. So slow down and assess things, because biases are really kind of a quick way for human beings to try to feel like they're understanding a situation. And then another way is to get a second opinion, walk down the hallway and talk to someone else about this. If this person has this kind of tattoo, does it mean that they're a violent person, or whatever the bias is that we think that we have? Maybe we could get a second opinion of someone else and see what they think about it. We also need to recognize that victims come into our system and they're going to have some surprises. The first one is prosecutors do not represent victims. They represent the state. And usually the victim's interests and the state's interests align with each other, usually, but not always. And so we need to explain to them the separation of this, and that they're not represented by the prosecutors. Also, everybody assumes that police and prosecutors always agree on everything and work together as one agency, and that's not true either. They're designed to be independent agencies, and we're supposed to be kind of a check on each other, the police and the prosecution. We're supposed to be, we're supposed to have a friendly working relationship, but we're also independent of each other. And so people don't really realize that either, and think, well, the police officer told me X, Y, and Z would happen. And that may or may not be true. So they need to be apprised of those things. The thing that I always tell victims when they come into the system, because one of the things that victims, I think, another thing that victims are surprised at is how long cases can take to be resolved. It's not like TV where you report a crime and the next day you're in jury trial. So I always tell victims, look, you and I, we're on a long road together. You have to be patient. We're just going to take this one step at a time. And we can't make promises to you about what's going to happen. We can only promise you that we will do the best we can, and we'll be with you through this whole process. So that's another sort of myth that we need to dispel with victims, is that it's not going to be resolved quickly. And I always tell them some cases resolve in several months, but some take several years. So it depends on, a lot of factors, but they need to be prepared for that. One of the things that I really believe this is true, we can help develop victims' healing and promote victims' healing throughout the system if we're conscious of that and aware of it and do it intentionally. Resiliency, in other words, each person's ability to survive difficult things, is not, and it doesn't have to be an inborn talent. It's a skill that can be developed. And resiliency, I like this definition of it. Resiliency is a dynamic process, so constantly evolving process of adaptation to adversities that develops over time. We need to tell victims to, focus on the next hurdle. And then once you get over that, focus on the next hurdle. And each time they survive a little step in the system, the better it is when the next step comes. Okay? Let's just get through the next hearing. Let's just get through the next meeting. Let's just get through this, this, and this, and take it one hurdle at a time. Because it is really like a race where you're jumping over hurdles. But I really believe this, each time you jump over a hurdle and you survive that, it helps you get through the next one. And I think that we need to focus victims. Another thing that I would frequently do with victims is I would have sort of a debriefing with them after something that was difficult. Like, for example, the preliminary hearing. I almost always did a debriefing with a victim after the preliminary hearing. And I would go sit with them in one of the conference rooms near the courtroom, and I would say, okay, what was your favorite thing about today? What was the hardest thing about today? I always debrief with them because I think that that helps them look back on the process and realize, wait a minute, I survived that. I did really well. And whatever was a good experience for them, I want them to talk about that. And I think that that helps them after each significant hurdle. If we do debriefing, it helps develop resiliency in them. Does that make sense? Another thing is be aware that victims won't see the courtroom like we see it. We're used to the courtroom. We're used to the chaos that goes on in there, right? But I would encourage you to go sit in a courtroom somewhere, not one that you're used to, a different one. Go sit in a courtroom once there, pretend that you've never been in a courtroom before, and just observe how it is. It's very chaotic. One victim described it to me as like, I thought it was going to be very dignified and quiet, and it was like a chicken market where they're auctioning off chickens, and the feathers are flying everywhere, and it's just chaos everywhere. And that's really kind of what it's like. And we have to prepare victims for that as well, as make sure they have somebody that they can debrief with, talk about what that was like for them, because it's a whole different experience than they really thought it was going to be. As professionals in the system, I think we need to recognize that victims will have a wide range of emotions through the case. Sometimes they'll be sad, sometimes they'll be frustrated, sometimes they'll be happy, ecstatic at something that happened. The judge ruled in our favor on that issue or whatever. But we need to be prepared to weather the ups and downs, to weather the storms, because it's going to be like a roller coaster ride for them through this crazy system. One time they might be, upset and distressed and crying and saying they're never going to go through, they don't want to go through this system anymore. The next time they could be ecstatic because something went well. So we need to be the calming factor that goes through the whole case. And again, I think debriefing is a really important thing to do with victims, especially at important things. Another thing is that we need to talk with victims about what they see, what they envision justice being like. Like, what do you want to see happen in this case? Because I have been surprised. Through the whole 32 years that I was a prosecutor, I was surprised at some things that victims told me that they wanted to see in the system and that they wanted to have happen. As prosecutors, we get very tunnel vision. We get very tunnel vision on, we got to get a conviction. We got to get a conviction, and that's the only thing that matters. That's not the only thing that matters. Sometimes I remember one time working with a victim, and she didn't want me to make a plea offer. And I said, okay, well, tell me about that. Tell me why you don't want me to make a plea offer. And she said, well, the most important thing to me is I want to tell my story. I want him and his family and the judge and everybody to hear what happened to me. And I said, oh, okay. Well, guess what? You get to do that at the sentencing. So we need to recognize that justice is subjective. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing, and that victims may have a different concept of what justice is for them. One of the things that we need to confront also is implicit biases about sex offenders. We all have a picture in our mind, at least for those people who haven't been involved in the criminal justice system, have a picture in their mind of what a sex offender looks like, right? And how they behave and how they, everybody has that sort of picture. if I showed you these two pictures, which one of these people would you think was a sex offender? This is Brian David Mitchell there. That's his jail booking photo. He's the person that kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. And then on the right is Aunt B from what was the name of that show? Andy Griffith's show. So which one of those people would most people think was the sex offender? Okay, actually, these people are both sex offenders in my case that I had. In my case that I had a woman who looked very grandmotherly. And, you know, she had been a nanny 20 years earlier. And so we had to deal with that during the trial. And so I had to deal with this sort of bias that a grandmother wouldn't do those kind of things to a child. This grandmotherly, nice appearing person wouldn't do that. So I have a theory that biases exist in general. And you have to show that this defendant and this victim are very individual people. For example, I'll give you an example. A lot of people have this idea, all lawyers are bad. All lawyers are crooked. All lawyers cheat. All lawyers are aggressive and nasty people. Okay? Like generally, lawyers are this category of bad people. But almost all of them will say, oh, but my lawyer's great. My lawyer really cares about me. My lawyer does a good job. My lawyer. So that's the difference between generalized bias and an individual person. And we have to show the individuality of the people. That will help our case. One of the things that we did with this nice grandmotherly looking lady at the trial in front of the jury is we wanted to show the jury that she used her position of special trust to help with the perpetration. In other words, nobody would really believe that she would be doing something like that. So that gave her lots of freedom, lots of opportunities to take the kids off by themselves, right? So she exploited that relationship. She created isolation of this particular victim, the man who became a rabbi, and she used her status to hide her abuse. So we were able to show specific examples of how she did all those things during the trial. And that was important because the bias was, well, a grandmother wouldn't do that. A nice looking lady that's a nanny wouldn't do that. And so we had to show them the specifics of how she actually really did that. When I remember the rabbi telling me when he first went and sat down in the courtroom, when we had selected the jury, he looked over at the jury and they gave him that, that look, like they didn't really believe him. And hey, wait a minute, you can't be a victim. And so that's what we're dealing with members of society in our cases and with members of the juries is they are, you know, and I don't believe that people are doing it intentionally to be mean or bad or whatever. I think it's a defense mechanism that we all have. We don't want to believe that these crimes really happen. And so we create this worldview that says, oh, there must have been a misunderstanding. Oh, she wouldn't do that. She's a nanny. She's an older lady. Oh, he really wasn't a victim. You know, that it didn't hurt him. So we have to take time to confront those sort of biases. And our approach was, we're going to make this rabbi very much an individual. We're going to talk about what his life was like as a child, the hobbies that he had, things that he would do. Would he ride his bike? He would ride his bike around the neighborhood and meet the other kids. And I mean, we took a lot of time during the trial to show him as an individual. and to show him as a person who really was affected by the abuse, and the abuse that had an effect on him, and we showed that to the jury. We have to customize our cases to fit the victim's experience. These are two different victims here that may have had different experiences, and they're both at different life stages. One of the things that I did was I had him bring a picture of himself for the jury, that of him as a child. And we put it in a spot in the courtroom where it would be facing the jury and showing the jury all the time. And I just left it sitting there to remind the jury of this was a very individual little child that was affected here. Even though he looks like a very professional and capable person now, he was a child when it happened. So we have to customize our cases to show the judge or the jury, whoever is hearing the case, that this is an individual that was affected. One of the things that I really try to do in all my cases is acknowledge the aftermath of the crime, acknowledge what it did to that victim. And that is a way I think of honoring the victim and their journey, is to allow them to tell the story of what happened to them both before and after the crime. And it's also very persuasive to the jury. You know, it's very powerful evidence. If the people of this town told you that there had been a tornado, would you believe them? Yes, you would, because look at the aftermath. And so it not only honors the victim and allows them to tell their story more completely, but it also is very powerful for the jury. I often ask victims, is there any part of the story that you really want the judge or the jury to know? And if it's admissible, I will ask you questions about it. So I talk with them about, is there any part of your story that you want to be heard? Because evidence, they may have they may have this much knowledge and you're trying to present this much, but there may be one piece of the story that they really want told. And so one of the things that I did is in this particular case, and I try to do with all my cases that went to trial, is I would ask victims, what part do you want the jury really to know? Is there something? And I can't guarantee you it'll be admissible, but if it is admissible and I have an argument that I can make to the judge, I will ask you about it in front of the jury so that you can tell them. And one of them, in our case that we had with the rabbi, was trying to dispel that bias that males aren't real victims. I took some time in front of the jury to talk about how it affected him. And it really shook him to his core that this was happening. He thought he was in a very religious, very Orthodox home, and he thought that God was going to punish him for what had happened. One of the quotes from his testimony was, about that he thought God was going to cause his death, so he wouldn't be on the earth anymore. And when he walked down the street, he was convinced that maybe a car would swerve and run him over, or, maybe something would happen. There would be some accident that would cause his death. And that was something that was present in his mind all the time. So I wanted to share that with the jury because it made him very, very real, and it made them understand that he really was affected by these crimes. And so I think that we need to look for ways to show how our victims were affected by the crimes. One of the biases we had in our case, this is a picture of the rabbi. One of the biases in our case was that he didn't report it for 20 years. Well, That's a hurdle for us to overcome, because most jurors have this kind of false idea in their head that if anything like this ever happened to them, they would walk over to the phone and call 911 right away. Well, that never happens, or extremely rarely does that ever happen. And so I told him that if the defense challenged him on that, he should tell the real truth about why he didn't report. And then this was his answer. Can you guys hear that?
No, it just kind of sounds garbled.
Is it just not loud enough, or can you not hear it at all?
We can't hear it at all.
Oh. Okay. So I'll just give you a summary of what he said. He said, and the defense attorney says, so why didn't you tell someone if this was really happening? And he said, because exactly what's happening right now. I'm being called a liar. I'm being called the aggressor. I'm being accused of making this up to get attention. All of these things I feared would happen to me, and it's happening right now. Which was great, because that's what their defense was. He just loved the attention, and so that's why he made this all up, right? So that was another way that we took on that bias, is that I told him, just tell him the truth about why you didn't report. And they gave him, they opened the door for him, for him to do that. One of the things that I did right before the trial started was such a silly little thing, but later he told me how much that meant to him that I had done that. And just to give you the really short version of the story, he came to my office to meet with me and do preparation for his testimony on Halloween. He was in my office on Halloween, the day of Halloween. And there were kids wandering around the hallways trick-or-treating, the office, the prosecutors and the advocates and everybody, legal assistants, they brought their kids or their grandkids in costumes, and they went around the hallways, and we gave them candy. Well, there was only one type of, and he was kind of hungry because he had missed lunch that day. And I said, well, here, have some candy. He says, well, it has to be kosher. I can't just eat any candy. And remember, he's really Orthodox, very strict Orthodox, because he's a rabbi now, right? So he said, well, if you have any Laffy Taffy, I can eat that. And it says on the back of the wrapper, you would never notice this otherwise, unless you were Orthodox Jewish. It says at the bottom that it's kosher. It has gone through the process to be a kosher food. So I brought him in a pile of one of the prosecutors had Laffy Taffy like this that they were handing out, and I went and grabbed a whole bunch of them, and I brought them into the office and gave them to him. And so he ate those while we were meeting. Well, the first day of the jury trial, we were all in the courtroom, and he came in and sat down, and I took out some Laffy Taffy and I went over and handed it to him. And I said, if you're getting stressed, have some of this candy. Candy always helps, And he later told me how much that meant to him, that I remembered that he could have that candy, and I brought it with me. So we need to, I think, treat our victims as, individuals, and find ways to recognize them as an individual and not just a number in our office, or not just a case file. They're an individual, and they deserve to be recognized for that. I think we underestimate the impact of sometimes of sentencing, how important that is for victims. Like I told you before, I had a victim once that didn't want to do a plea bargain because she was afraid her story would never be told. And we need to really emphasize with victims that they will have a chance to say whatever is important to them about this and how this affected them and so forth, because they won't be cross-examined. They don't have to, get up there on the witness stand. They can, stand with someone next to them, supporting them and read it. And it's actually, I think, a very therapeutic kind of event for them, for a lot of them. And so don't forget the impact of that sentencing and allowing them that time to be very much an individual. Okay, Vicky, do I need to talk more? I was thinking everybody would like it if we quit a little bit early.
Yes, of course. No, thank you so much, Donna. You always so informative.
Sure, and if anybody has any questions or you want to use me as a resource, please feel free to call me. Sometimes it helps just to have somebody else with, to bounce ideas off of. If you have a case that you're struggling with, call me and I might have a suggestion that might help. So please use me. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Donna. We really appreciate it. And you guys can probably see in the chat too, Beatrice kind of added in the chat her contact information as the advocate at the legal clinic. So you can see that there. And just some comments that they appreciated your perspective on the prosecutor. So we really appreciate the highlight of those rights that ways in the prosecutor and the advocate can work together to bring in and honor those rights. So thank you so much, Donna. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.